What did the angels do when they saw Jesus Christ on the cross? Nothing that day was a reaction. Nothing escaped control. When Jesus Christ was lifted up on the cross, heaven did not fall into disarray. Heaven aligned itself like an army receiving a harsh order and carrying it out without hesitation. What the angels did there broke the pattern of everything they had done before. Their most striking gesture was not to descend, but to remain, and that act of remaining carried a weight that almost no one notices when looking only at the cross. The scene was exposed with no shadow to soften the view. A man suspended between earth and heaven, wood-scarred, iron driven in, screams below, laughter mixed with weeping, and a kind of expectation that came not only from the crowd, but from all of history. Above, legions watched without moving from their place, not out of indifference, but by command. The silence was not empty. It was sustained, dense, as if every second was being preserved so that nothing would be broken before its time. That moment did not reveal weakness, but a limit, an invisible limit, imposed by the eternal plan itself, as if heaven had more than enough power in its hands and yet was forced to keep its fist clenched. When they saw Jesus on the cross, the angels obeyed in a way they had never experienced before. They sustained, watched over, restrained themselves, and this silent discipline upheld something capable of changing the destiny of humanity and reorganizing the very meaning of obedience in heaven. The body was suspended, wounded, exposed before everyone. The cross atop Golgotha was not just a Roman instrument. It was the point where human pain touched the government of God, hiding nothing, without makeup, without a comfortable distance. Scripture records angels descending to open prisons, shut the mouths of lions, announce births, and execute judgment with precision. The pattern has always been clear. When there is a real threat to the purpose, heaven moves, and the movement is usually swift. Before the cross, the movement did not come. What became impossible to ignore was the visible absence of intervention, and this struck the scene like a parallel blow because everyone had already seen, in other times, heaven act with power. Heaven was watching closely. The Bible itself gives hints that angels observe human events with zeal. The Apostle Peter says that there are things related from before the foundation of the world in Revelation chapter 13, verse 8. This reveals that the cross did not appear as a late response to sin. It occupied the center of the plan from the very beginning. While the earth screamed, mocked, and accused, heaven held its ground. There was no trumpet, no sword coming down, no public intervention. There was vigilance and absolute submission to a command that held history exactly where it needed to be. That silence was not passivity. It held the unfolding of events at the right point, as if any rupture would turn the sacrifice into an escape. Any rushed rescue would leave redemption unfinished. Any shortcut would destroy the meaning of surrender. There, heaven learned something new about God himself. The angels had always known power. On that day, they came to know the depth of decision, not through words, but by the command to remain, even as the Son was wounded before their very eyes. They did not fail, nor did they neglect their duty, nor did they disappear. They obeyed and upheld the plan with the utmost discipline of those who guard God's timing, without anticipating anything. And the further the scene progressed, the more this faithfulness became the central detail, because the silence of heaven at Golgotha does not end the story. It serves as the first clue that there is a set moment when the order will change, and when it does, nothing will be able to contain what is coming. The angels have never acted on impulse. When they appear in the scriptures, there is a clear pattern behind it. Order received, mission accomplished, silent return. They move with precision, like those who serve a royal government, with hierarchy, command, and purpose. From the very beginning, the Bible describes these beings as messengers. In Hebrews chapter 1, verse 14, it is written that they are ministering spirits, sent to serve those who will inherit salvation. Sent is not just a figure of speech. It means boundary, destination, and task. The angel goes only as far as the order allows. When Lot was in Sodom, they entered the city, pulled the man inside, shut the door, and took him out before judgment fell. In Genesis chapter 19, the scene is direct, no delay, no negotiation. They carry out their task, protect the righteous, and what comes next strikes the city when it does not diminish the heavens. It reveals absolute alignment with a greater purpose, one that needed to be fulfilled without interruption. There is a boundary that has never changed. Angels do not redeem, do not replace, do not take on roles that belong only to the Son. They serve, protect, announce, and carry out. Salvation has always belonged to God Himself, and no heavenly host can take that place. That is why, when the story reaches the point where redemption must be accomplished, heaven enters a territory that cannot be resolved by force. No angelic sword pays for sin. No legion can substitute the required sacrifice. What is at stake there is the price, not a confrontation. The angels knew this boundary. They knew their role, the extent of their own authority, and the risk of crossing the line that had been set for them. To break that restraint would mean to harm the very purpose they had served from the beginning. To remain in position at that moment was to remain faithful to their own identity. This silent faithfulness is unlike anything they had ever experienced. It does not require strength, it requires self-control. It does not require action, it requires waiting. It does not produce a visible victory in that instant. It demands total trust in the command received, even when the scene seems to call for the opposite. The cross then does not reveal inactive angels. It reveals angels under the most difficult order ever given, to remain alert, aware, capable of acting, but restrained. Every second in front of the wounded Son put this obedience to the test, in a way that had never before been demanded of heaven. This pattern explains why no angel appears to interrupt the trial, prevent the nails, or silence the insults. It was not a lack of power, but total submission to a plan that required the Son to walk to the end without rescue, because the rescue would be the sacrifice itself. Heaven also knew that there is a moment when the order changes. When it changes, the response usually comes without delay, as always happened in the ancient stories. Before that, however, there was a stretch in which faithfulness would be measured by the ability not to act. This is the backdrop for what comes next. Without understanding how heaven usually moves, it's impossible to feel the weight of restraint before the cross. And it is this restraint that begins to take concrete shape when the story moves forward to the first moment in which heaven strengthens without delivering, sustains without rescuing. Without rescuing, it remains present without breaking the plan. The night wore on, and the weight of what was to come stopped being just an idea and became a reality. The Son was far from the crowds and far from the judges, alone enough to hear his own breath falter. He knelt in the dark, and each minute seemed to push his soul toward a decision that no one else could make. The Gospel according to Luke records that his sweat became like drops of blood falling to the ground in chapter 22, verse 44. The scene does not call for embellishment. It calls for the courage to face it. The marked face, the damp skin, the ground receiving what reveals a suffering that began even before the nails. Up until then, whenever God's purpose seemed threatened, heaven would usually respond with intervention. Doors were opened, kings were restrained, dangers were neutralized. That night, the point of tension did not come from soldiers, but from the path that had to be crossed completely, with no escape and no shortcut. It was at this point that a rare event occurred. Luke chapter 22, verse 43, records that an angel appeared to strengthen him. Just one, without an escort, without fanfare, without any gesture of war. A brief, steady presence, like someone who enters only to support the next step. This reveals the kind of angelic participation that was required that night. Heaven did not disappear, nor did it open an escape route. The angel did not come to alter the destiny, but to ensure that the Son would reach the end of it, whole enough to keep walking. Never before had an angel been sent with this specific mission. Not to deliver from danger, not to announce a birth, not to execute judgment. He came to strengthen someone who was about to carry something that no celestial being could take upon themselves. The angels knew strength, they knew order, they knew victory. There they saw that there is a kind of faithfulness that is not measured by attack, but by support. It was not raw power, it was refined obedience. The angel did not bring distraction, but firmness, like someone who holds the weight at the exact moment so that the decision remains standing. The sun rose from prayer, still pressed within, but with the path set. The help came in just the right measure, within a limit that cannot be crossed. Not a step beyond, not a gesture more. This was not born out of incapacity. It was born out of command. The logic of that night is revealed here. When the order is not to deliver, help takes another form. The suffering was not broken. It was sustained so that it would not crush before its time. The goal was to preserve the mission without interrupting what needed to be completed. Meanwhile, the disciples slept, overcome by exhaustion. The son's loneliness became even harsher when he saw those who loved him overcome by sleep. Heaven could have filled that place with a visible presence, but kept its distance, as if guarding the sacred boundary of what must be crossed without a substitute. That distance was not abandonment, it was respect for the plan. The angels knew that this path had to be walked by the Son, alone, as far as justice required. Any greater intervention would change the meaning of what was being done. The angel did not remain visible either. The task was brief. He entered, strengthened, and left. This pattern says a lot. Heaven did not come to accompany every sigh, but to ensure that the decision would not be interrupted before its time. Shortly after, the night was broken by footsteps and light. Torches appeared, voices drew near, and the traitor came to the front of the group, like someone who knows the place. The angel was no longer there. The phase of restraint was advancing, and silent readiness once again dominated the heavens. When Peter reacted, the blade appeared before the thought. He struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his ear, and the Gospels identify the man as Malchus in chapter 18 of the Gospel according to John, verse 10. The Son immediately stopped the impulse, touched the wounded man, and healed him, as recorded in Luke chapter 22, verse 51, dismantling any attempt to turn that moment into a fight. It became clear there, even to the angels, that the path would not be diverted by human force. What stood before them was not a battle to be won, but a sacrifice to be fulfilled. Restraint was not weakness. It was the kind of obedience that holds back the hand at the very moment it most wants to act. In that same setting, the Son affirmed that he could ask the Father for entire legions of angels, as recorded in the Gospel according to Matthew chapter 26, verse 53. The power was ready, but the command never came. That statement was not theatrical. It was exposed self-control. It was out of reach. Everything remained within the decision. The angels heard and understood the weight of it. A single word would change the scene, as it always had in other stories. The absence of that word confirmed the order they already carried. Remain in position, do not act beyond what is permitted, uphold the plan with discipline. From that moment on, the pattern that would continue until the cross was set. Heaven helps when authorized, sustains when necessary, and withdraws when the purpose requires the Son to walk without rescue. That angel who strengthened him in the night was not an exception, but a sign of how obedience would work until the end. The burden did not lessen, it only became bearable enough to go on. The Son walked toward imprisonment with steady steps, not because the pain had ceased, but because the decision was sealed and would not be broken by any human noise. The dawn kept advancing, and heaven remained watchful, restrained, steadfast. What began there would continue to a point where no intervention would be allowed, and the silence, which already had a cost, would begin to demand even more. The hands were tied firmly. The Son did not react with violence, did not try to buy time, did not ask for a way out. The group moved through the night, crossing familiar paths that suddenly became a route of surrender, step by step, as if the entire city had been rearranged to lead him to the final point. The transfer to Annas' house happened without commotion, but with cold intent. Questions arose quickly. Improvised accusations tried to take hold. Testimonies overlapped. Nothing there resembled justice. There was only haste and convenience. And even so, no force from heaven broke through the scene. The angels remained in position, maintaining the silence that had weighed since the garden. The Son spoke only what was necessary and chose silence when words would be used as a weapon against his very purpose. The Gospel according to Matthew records false witnesses rising up in chapter 26, verses 59 to 61. Heaven knew every lie, but it also knew the kind of truth that can only be confirmed when the story is allowed to run its full course. The move to Caiaphas's house intensified the aggression. Insults, mockery, quick blows, his face covered, the taunt to name who had struck him. Even so, nothing got out of the Son's control. The Gospel according to John chapter 19 verse 11 records that he stated that no authority existed there without higher permission. Heaven knew this. Imprisonment was not defeat. It was a passage, and what seemed like human dominion was merely a narrow corridor through which the purpose advanced. While the cross was being prepared and the soldiers organized the route, heaven's readiness remained intact. No strength was withdrawn, no ability was diminished. There was only a clear order that ran through every minute. Remain, watch, sustain the right time. This remaining was not absence. Any movement out of time would destroy what had been built since the beginning. The angels knew that if they intervened there, the sacrifice would be incomplete and the price would remain unpaid. The Son began to walk with his body already drained. The weight of the cross added to his wounded flesh, and each step cost more than the last. He fell, and a man was compelled to help carry it, and heaven did not interfere. The path had to be walked to the very end, with all the shame in plain sight, without shortcuts. The angels accompanied the journey, knowing that the order not to act was reaching its absolute limit, and yet obedience was maintained. Imprisonment and trial were endured without rescue, without rupture, without a violent response. The silence was no longer just strange. It became unbearably significant. This part of the story marked a definitive line. Human injustice was not corrected at that moment. It was left exposed to the very edge, as living proof of what the world does when it holds power in its hands. This decision did not diminish heaven. It revealed total submission to a purpose greater than any immediate relief. The cross was already in sight, and the place of execution was drawing near. The silence that began in the prison now moved into even more extreme territory, and heaven remained watchful, aware that the hardest moment was still to come. The top of Golgotha became the stage for many layers unfolding at once. Soldiers carrying out protocol with coldness, religious leaders trying to control the narrative, onlookers seeking a spectacle, and followers staying close without being able to stop anything. The Son was lifted up on the cross, and heaven remained silent, not out of distance. Each gesture pushed the scene toward a point that, in other stories, would have received an immediate response from above. There, order remained intact, and restraint became a living discipline. Pedro stayed at a distance, trying to be invisible. The courtyard, lit by fire, outlined faces and shadows, and the questions came simply, the kind that hurt on the inside. Courage broke into 3 denials before the rooster crowed, and the sound cut through the dawn like a sentence. The sun heard, the sky heard, and no angel came down to prevent the fall, which needed to reveal who Peter was, without the sun by his side. At daybreak they took him to Pilate. The representative of Rome found no guilt, but felt the weight of the mounting pressure. The Son was sent to Herod, returned exposed as a political pawn, going back and forth between powers that wanted to keep their hands clean. Heaven watched in restraint, offering no relief to the system that chose cowardice. When Pilate placed before them the choice between the Son and Barabbas, the crowd answered like a trained chorus. The release of the guilty and the condemnation of the innocent sealed the moral bankruptcy of the moment. The Gospel, according to John chapter 18, verse 40, records the chosen name, and heaven remained steadfast, without changing the order. The scourging came next, and their violence ceased to be a threat and became a method. The Roman flogging was calculated blow after blow until the blood flowed uncontrollably. The angels knew that instrument. They had already seen men collapse with less, and yet they remained restrained, aware that the Son's body needed to go through it without rescue. A crown of thorns was pressed onto his head, the robe was put on in mockery, and the false scepter was handed over as a theater of humiliation. The Son was treated as a caricature of a king, and heaven knew the true throne of the one being ridiculed. The restraint did not lessen, it grew heavier with each gesture, which seemed to demand an immediate response. Pilate still tried to release him, argued, backed down, washed his hands. The gesture did not change the outcome. The sentence was pronounced: crucifixion, the slow, public, and degrading death that Rome used to crush. Heaven's command remained in force, without a single breach, even